We have a terrific program. We will hear from Susan Glasser. But even before that, I'm very pleased to say that the president of the Cosmos Club, Michael Pacalico, is here with us tonight. Mike is the CEO of the firm Special Investigations and has been an investment banker, U.S. Navy helicopter pilot, and novelist, among other things. And Mike will say a few words.
Thank you, Greg. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Mike.
Ladies and gentlemen, as Mr. Pfeiffer said, I'm Michael Pacalico. I am the 141st president of the Cosmos Club in an unbroken line that goes back to the explorer John Wesley Powell, who founded this great institution on Saturday evening, 16 November of 1878. And that was here in Washington, D.C., and next week we're going to celebrate our 145th anniversary, and our Sesquicentennial Commission is already here. But I'm here to welcome each of you on behalf of the 2,700 members of the Cosmos Club, because this institution, the Cosmos Club, has an intertwined relationship with the Institute of Current World Affairs that goes back 98 years in your history. And to explain exactly what that means, I want to talk about, very briefly, 12 men. And that begins, importantly, with Charles Richard Crane and Walter Stowell Rogers. Charles Crane, elected to the Cosmos Club in 1915 in the category manufacturer. And Walter Stowell Rogers, your first executive director, elected as publicist in 1916. Now, Crane, obviously, those of you who know the Institute's long and storied history, was a favorite of another member of the Cosmos Club, Woodrow Wilson, elected 1913 as political scientist. Now, as all of you know, Woodrow Wilson, as president, has fallen into great disfavor for his attitudes at the time and today, which were abhorrent with respect to race. And there's no but here. There is, friends, a recognition of what Wilson did and said for this country and in the expression of values that we still hold today here at the Cosmos Club and in this institution to which he was close and which Crane was close to. Those of American idealism, of change in the international order, of collective security, of a moral base for diplomacy, of an end to colonialism, of self-determination of free peoples, of cooperation among nations, giving rise to the League of Nations and later to the United Nations, of disparate aims coming together of nations, and especially of what today we know as arms control, and of what today we call an American internationalism and a rise to globalism. And that, friends, was what Crane did for Wilson in France, in Russia, in China, and in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Crane and Walter Rogers, your first executive director, were the two sponsors to the Cosmos Club for Peter Martin, who we only lost 2 years ago. Peter Martin, elected to the Cosmos Club as publisher in 1978. And Peter Martin was the sponsor to the Cosmos Club for Gregory Pfeiffer, elected to the Cosmos Club 2018 in the category of Russian Studies. Wilson's cabinet included men like Newton Deal Baker, Secretary of War for the United States in the Great War, elected to the Cosmos Club 1917 as government official. Thomas Watt Gregory, Attorney General in the Wilson administration, elected 1914 in the category of lawyer. Franklin Knight Lane, Secretary of the Interior, lawyer, elected 1913. William Cox Redfield, Secretary of Commerce, elected as industrialist in 1911. David Franklin Houston, Secretary of Agriculture, elected as political scientist in 1915. William McAdoo, Secretary of the Treasury, elected as lawyer 1913, and Albert Sidney Burleson, Postmaster General of the United States, elected as government official in 1906, all of which were the globalist internationalists of the age, and those whose legacy we bear at the Cosmos, and whose deep legacy through Crane, through Walter Rogers, through Peter Martin, and today by Gregory Pfeiffer, you enjoy in this incredible institution, like two strains of DNA wrapped in and among itself. This is the reason why, for years, forever, the Institute of Current World Affairs visits the Cosmos Club for this annual dinner. It is my pleasure to welcome you, to thank you for being part of our history, thank you for the work you do. I wear a poppy tonight because I'm a veteran, and this is Veterans Day weekend. Today is the holiday, tomorrow is the actual day, and we'll be gathering at 11 o'clock to recognize that time when we thought that we were ending the war to end all wars, and yet today, in Ukraine, in the Middle East, the troubles persist, and it is your work that will indeed end those wars to end all wars. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for being here at the Cosmos. Have a great evening. Respect and many blessings to you for your work.
Thank you so much, Mike, for those flattering words for the Institute. The Cosmos Club has indeed been a gathering place for the Institute ever since Crane first moved here temporarily. Crane was a philanthropist, diplomat, an heir to the plumbing family fortune, and he was, as Mike said, a close friend and advisor to President Woodrow Wilson, also the president of this club, Wilson was, and Crane wanted to be near Wilson after he suffered his debilitating stroke in 1919, because Wilson was largely confined to his house in neighboring Kalorama. We're so very happy to continue meeting here in this fabulous place nearly a century on. This evening, you don't need me to tell you that we are here at a time that is especially alarming in international affairs. The horrific attacks of October 7th and now the war in the Middle East with its mounting thousands of civilians dead are spreading fury, fear, and anguish around the world, along with worry about a larger conflict. Helping to find a way out of the spiraling cycles of hatred and violence, as Mike mentioned, will require an especially deep understanding of each different society, its cultures, and its motives. It's the kind of understanding fellows of the Institute of Current World Affairs have been acquiring for the last almost 100 years. We send outstanding young professionals abroad around the globe for independent research, critical thinking, and writing during 2 years of cultural immersion. One of our recent fellows in Jerusalem, Neri Zilber, is now reporting daily about the conflict for the Financial Times, for CNN, and elsewhere. I was lucky enough to be a fellow a quarter century ago as a young journalist in Russia. The first day of my fellowship coincided with the very first day of Vladimir Putin's presidency, as it happened. And I remember very well the developments prompted by another terrible attack that altered the course of history, September 11th. Back then, Putin was the first world leader to call President George W. Bush with condolences. And he also proposed the formation of an international anti-terror coalition. Many in the West took the offer as a sign Putin wanted Russia's integration into the international community of liberal democracies. In fact, the opposite was true. Putin did want integration, but on his terms. He wanted the West to drop its criticism of his brutal war in Chechnya, which had brought him to power, and accept him as an equal among global leaders. That intention filtered down to the Moscow officials to whom I spoke at the time, who barely struggled to conceal their glee over the attacks against the United States. It was a moment that Western countries were supposed to be humbled into accepting the Kremlin's 19th century worldview of geopolitics. In short, each side looked at the other and made the mistake of seeing not the other, but their own reflections in the mirror. For us, the warning signs about Putin were there all along. Nevertheless, no one could have predicted Putin's war against Ukraine. But our failure to act on his challenge earlier is forcing us to deal with far greater consequences now, above all the Kremlin's existential attack on the Ukrainian people, to whom the battle never should have befallen. They are now sacrificing lives in a struggle for our common values, interests, and security, and against Putin's 19th century nightmare. That much is clear, at least to me, but we're still running a risk of getting Russia wrong in the long term. For many decades, or a few decades at least, starting in 1991, we ignored Russian history, seeing the result of the Soviet collapse simply as a ruin on which to build a new democratic society, not one still steeped in its traditional autocratic political culture. Now, finally, we are looking to history and culture to explain Putin's longevity and his appeal to Russians, but we run the risk of making that the only explanation, of failing to interpret the current changing conditions that inform Russian behavior for real, practical reasons. Looking mainly to past manifestations of Russian imperialism to describe the present as almost inevitable is reinforcing a collective blame of all Russian society, including natural allies in the effort against the Kremlin's war. But some Russians have been banging the drum about Putin longer than the rest of us, and they will be the key, or at least part of the key, to a future open Russia. In no conflict should entire societies be blamed. The Institute has had a long connection to Russia and an impact on how our country views Moscow. Crane, there he is, knew Tsar Nicholas II, but he was also an admirer and acquaintance of leading pre-revolutionary intellectuals. In the early 1900s, he was a sponsor of Pavel Milyukov, the liberal politician, founder of the Constitutional Democratic, or Cadet Party, who was foreign minister in the provisional government overthrown by the Bolshevik Revolution. Later in the 1930s, the Institute sent a young American law school graduate named John Hazard to the Soviet Union at the height of Stalin's Great Terror. There's John Hazard much later at an ICWA function. And it was around that time that he wrote that before his fellowship, he, quote, knew no Russian history, and no Marxist theory. While he was in the Soviet Union, Hazard sat in seminars taught by Stalinist lecturers who, he later half-joked, merely paused in the anteroom to wash the blood of purges from their hands. Hazard went on to become one of the leading Western scholars of Soviet law, who helped found Columbia University's Harriman Institute, where he mentored generations of future leading experts, including my dad in the 1960s. ICWA has been in the business of cultivating deep understanding of global societies for a very long time. The cultural immersion of our fellowships has helped foster the careers of many leading internationalists in academia, diplomacy, journalism, and many other fields. And a number of former fellows are here tonight, I'm happy to say. May I ask them to please stand up? Former fellows. I can name just a few with apologies to all the rest. And I ask, please raise your hands. Whit Mason, there in the corner, went to Turkey in 1998. Bacchetti Buogo examined healthcare systems in Cuba, Costa Rica, and India in 1992. Chris Dushek went back to her native Romania in 2004. There she is. And Catherine Roth-Kono was in Saudi Arabia, France, Algeria, Yemen, and Egypt, studying the Arab world in 1993. They have all done very impressive things since. Earlier today at the George Washington University's Elliott School, our newest alumnus, Joshua Lefkowitz, reported about his 2 years examining the Syrian diaspora. Joshua, may I ask you to please stand up? There he is in the back. Joshua was based in Istanbul, but traveled widely across Turkey and also to Iraq, Lebanon, Germany, Qatar, Kuwait, Armenia, Jordan, and Egypt. He immersed himself in far-flung communities of Syrians and their mounting difficulties as Bashar al-Assad is welcomed back into the international community, and as politicians and host countries assign blame for their local problems to Syrian migrants. And Joshua's writing has become very good, testament to which is his recent op-ed piece in the New York Times. I would like to raise a glass to Joshua in big congratulations. Hear, hear. Our current fellows are following in big footsteps. Aaron Uzlowski, up here on the screen, is based in Tbilisi, Georgia, examining Russians exiled following the Kremlin's invasion of Ukraine, with travel to Germany, Poland, the Baltics, and plans to visit Armenia, Turkey, and elsewhere. He is doing excellent narrative writing about the concrete lives and challenges of opposition leaders, rights activists, journalists, and others trying to establish themselves in exile, oppose Putin's war, and sway the opinions of Russians back home. James Courtwright is based in Senegal and has embedded himself in tiny villages across West Africa. His topic is the Fulani ethnic group, the world's largest pastoralist society, but minorities in each country, a window into the politics of each. He is often the first Westerner to come across this or that massacre in a lot of these villages, and how political and economic change is exacerbating local tensions and violence and helping militant groups recruit foot soldiers. James has gained deep insight at a time of coups across West Africa, with Russia fanning instability and China jockeying to increase its influence. He knows it like few others. He is worried, and his expertise is already in demand by embassies, think tanks, and others. Stephen Tagle is just finishing his remarkable fellowship in Greece. Funded by the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, he has explored life and culture across Greece's border zones and what they reveal about Greek identity and the country's place in the world. He's a former U.S. Embassy speechwriter, and his dispatches about life in the Evros region and the islands of Chios and Crete, and the country's shipping and tourism industry, relationship with Turkey, and burgeoning U.S. military presence have been highly praised by many Greeks themselves. He's now writing a book about his fellowship research. And finally, Prachi Vidwans has just started in South Korea, where she'll examine young people and society in a country that's seen staggering transformation in recent decades. And Edric Huang has just landed in Taiwan, where he'll report about LGBTQ+ issues as a David Mixner Fellow. They're both embarking on what I feel to be very, very promising fellowship plans. That kind of immersion is expensive. There's travel, and the Institute funds all of the fellows' living and work expenses. And we're able to do it only because of the generosity of our supporters, for which I am hugely grateful. Tomorrow, the Board of Trustees will select 2 more fellows. And may I ask the finalist candidates to please stand up who are with us. Savannah Weigel and Roland Robinson are comparative healthcare systems candidates for Europe and South America. Brett Simpson is proposing to examine Arctic climate change and its many effects to be based in Norway. And Luke Johnson would like to report on Poland and Central and Eastern Europe at a time of big change. They are all very, very impressive, and they've just been grilled for several hours upstairs by our trustees and deserve a very, very stiff drink. Good luck to all of you. So, back to the subject of getting things right. I'm very pleased to introduce the New Yorker magazine's staff writer and columnist, Susan Glasser. It is hard to overstate Susan's importance. Her most recent big piece, a telling portrait of the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, revealed important things about him and how the White House is dealing with Russia's war against Ukraine. Susan's been doing that kind of thing for a long time. She has served as the top editor of several Washington publications, including Politico, where she founded Politico magazine. And she also was at Foreign Policy, which won 3 National Magazine Awards during her tenure as editor-in-chief. Before that, she worked at the Washington Post, including as Moscow co-bureau chief with her husband, Peter Baker, who is here with us as well. He, of course, is now the New York Times chief White House correspondent, and his accomplishments would require another speech. Susan and Peter wrote the book Kremlin Rising, which is one of the definitive accounts of Putin's ascent. Their most recent book, published last year, is The Divider, the best-selling history of Donald Trump in the White House. We are delighted to have Susan here. After Susan speaks, she will take questions from the audience, and I ask that whoever is asking a question to please identify yourself and stick to one brief question. Thank you, and with that, I give you Susan.
All right. Well, just in time for dinner. That's always what, the ideal situation is, to have people eating. But I want to thank Greg for that wonderful introduction. I want to thank all of you for supporting this wonderful organization. Peter and I, having listened to those wonderful fellowship projects, we're thinking of applying. And I also want to thank Greg. Not only was that a very generous introduction, but his remarks about Russia really hit home, because we were in Moscow at the same time, and he did great work. If you haven't read his books, they are both terrific contributions to the literature. But, we were at a time when it was our collective, getting Russia wrong, and here we are 20 years later with this catastrophic war in Ukraine, something that I know everyone here thinks about every day. And in a way, he was introducing, sneak preview, the new book project that Peter and I have just begun working on, which involves looking at how it was that we came to this moment of February 2022. That being said, events have taken us in a different direction in the last few weeks, as we all know. And I have to say, I was reflecting, well, what could I possibly tell such an august group as this about the world? And so forgive me in advance for really trying to throw out a few provocations. And I do think the timing of this conversation we're going to have this evening is very resonant. Yesterday, of course, was November 9th, which was the 34th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And also, I should note, the 85th anniversary of Kristallnacht, the horrible pogrom of Jews in Germany. Like many people here, I imagine, although perhaps I'm on the older end, I like to think of myself as a child of 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall. We Gen Xers here in the United States, of course, if we didn't exactly agree that history was over, we certainly thought, as a result of that event, that it was moving in the right direction, that freedom and democracy were on the march, and things were bending in the right direction. A friend of mine, just a few years ago, said to me, it turns out that 1989 might have actually been the best year of our lives. We just didn't know it at the time. Well, to be honest, growing up in suburban America in the 1970s and 1980s, I have to say, I certainly didn't think at all about what had happened in Nazi Germany all those decades before. Kristallnacht was not part of my frame of reference. It barely registered for me. It seemed relegated to the textbooks. It did not in any way seem relevant to the present, never mind to the future. And yet here we are. Here we are. As I was walking into this event this evening, my son texted me from Stanford University, where 2 swastikas were found inside his dormitory today on the doors of Jewish students. I reflected upon this just a few hours after looking at an image on social media from an Ivy League university with the words Holocaust 2.0 chalked on the sidewalk. These are extraordinary times that we're living in, when history has come roaring back. I often reflect these days that it was a lot better when history was happening to other people. There's not a day, unfortunately now, that goes by in which there isn't a comparison. Some of them overheated, let's say, but some of them remarkably sober, between the geopolitical situation of today and that of the interwar 1920s and 1930s. Both periods, I'm afraid, can be characterized by a certain collective failure of imagination. And listening to Greg's description of that time when we all landed in Moscow a little bit more than 20 years ago is I think, a terrific example of that. We correspondents like to think of ourselves as eyewitnesses to history, but that requires being open to telling a story and trying to make sense of those data points. And in the same way that I'm sure that Israel will be grappling for many years to come with how it was unable to make sense of the data points that it had, which pointed to something catastrophic, we ourselves as correspondents certainly, I think, owe a duty to look back in time and to try to understand how did we get not only Vladimir Putin so wrong, but the moment in which we were living. From the very beginning of his time in politics in the last few years, when he announced his campaign in 2020, President Biden, sometimes I should note, much to the chagrin of his foreign policy advisors, has called this moment the start of a new era of conflict between autocracies and democracies. This is language that frankly makes many uncomfortable, and for some good reasons. This is a moment when America needs to expand its number of allies and partners, not to make people uncomfortable with our framing of it. And yet I would say that this provocation from President Biden also resonates, especially with events. There are many people, I would say, in both parties right now in the United States who see this at a minimum as an age of accelerating great power competition and conflict between the United States and its fraying international order and that of revisionist powers such as Russia and China. This was actually an unthinkable development just 2 decades ago when Peter and I arrived as young correspondents in Moscow. But I have to say, this notion of conflict between great powers is no longer theoretical. Since February 24th of 2022 and that Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's already real. It is happening. It is not something that we've conjured up in order to justify something or other. We have to be able to look at the facts on the ground. And this is a great failure. I think it is a great collective failure of imagination, one that requires years of examination. A year ago, I wrote a column for The New Yorker in which my friend and longtime fellow Russia watcher, Fiona Hill, offered a provocative observation. She said, well, what if we're already in World War III and we just don't know it yet? Now, I'm not sure this is inevitable. Also, we're eating dinner, so I don't want anybody to get too upset. But I have to say, events over the last month in the Middle East have reminded many of us, I'm sure, of the extent to which we cannot discount the possibility of a much wider war. How many of you in the last few weeks have contemplated the various things that could happen that would trigger, at a minimum, a broader regional conflict in the Middle East? And who knows where that would lead? It's not theoretical. It's something that's a very, very real possibility. Now, when I look at the way in which the world is lining up right now, I do see the possibility of a new kind of an axis, and I know that's a discredited word. I'm not talking about George W. Bush's rhetorical axis of evil, nor am I talking about the actual axis of World War II. But I think there is a new alliance, nonetheless, that we need to look much more squarely in the eye than we have been able to do. And that is an axis that does link the anti-Western, explicitly anti-US alliance of Russia and Iran, its proxies like Hamas and Hezbollah. This is a moment in time when they may not be allies in a formal sense, but we're looking at artillery shells by the millions from North Korea going to prop up the Russian war effort in Ukraine. We're looking at a moment when China seeks advantage to establish new bases in the Middle East because of Arab nations' disgruntlement with the United States for its support of Israel. Our expectations have shaped our thinking about what is possible at this moment, and I think it's a moment to revise those expectations. I've thought a lot about what it is that being a foreign correspondent can tell us in this moment of fracture and disruption. And it's very hard not just to bear witness, but to actually understand what the data points in front of you are telling you. And for me, there was a moment of recent history that I often look back on with great chagrin. And it's a moment that I think in some ways I really got wrong. And I want to share that with you in the spirit of all of us revising our thinking about what is even possible in this world at such a moment of disruption. I was the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine, and I decided to do a profile of Sergei Lavrov, the longtime Russian foreign minister. This was a long time ago. This was back in 2013. And I flew to Moscow, and he received me on the 7th floor of still the Soviet-era building in the heart of Moscow that is the headquarters of the Russian Foreign Ministry. And he sat down, and he had a message he wanted to send to the readers of Foreign Policy. And this is a message that I don't think I fully understood at the time, and I don't think readers really understood. But he sat down and he pulled out a note card, and on it he had written a quote from a very famous 19th century Russian foreign minister who served for many years in the aftermath of the Crimean War and the embarrassments of Russian foreign policy. And this was a foreign minister, Gorchakov. And Sergei Lavrov is reading this card to me, and he says, "I want you to know," quoting Gorchakov, "Russia is not sulking. She is composing herself." And what Sergei Lavrov was telling me was that Russia was done sulking. And after what it saw as the reverses of the collapse of the Soviet Union, which after all is something that Vladimir Putin called the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, that Russia was now ready to be engaged far beyond its borders. And I at least had the presence of mind to ask Sergei Lavrov, well, what exactly do you mean by this? Like, where do you imagine being active? And he proceeded to list off essentially every single region in the world. Every single region in the world. And, I came out of this interview and I was suitably, sort of concerned and chilled by this conversation. But I wasn't really able to put the pieces together. They were pieces that were there for me to see and for all of us to see. And the date of this conversation was less than a year before Russia's illegal annexation and takeover of the Crimean Peninsula and its efforts to move back into its pre-Soviet collapse borders in a way that has changed our world order. So maybe Fiona was wrong, and World War III didn't begin on February 22nd, 22. Maybe actually we'll look back on that moment in 2014 and say that was the moment when history changed, even if we didn't know it yet. And what I would say is that, as we have been correspondents and writing and thinking about the world over these last couple decades, the previous moments there, they had a name. They lent themselves to a ready kind of identification, these moments that we've experienced, right? The late Cold War was the period that we grew into adulthood. Of course, then there was the post-Cold War. Then there was the post-9/11 global war on terror. But I would like to ask all of you to think about this. What are we going to call this moment? Does it already have a name and we don't know it? When did it begin? Why is it that collectively we will struggle to come up with the answer to this question? I recently made a stab in a minor way at this. Actually, Greg was nice enough to refer to this piece I just wrote in the New Yorker about the National Security Advisor and the Biden administration's approach to the war in Ukraine. And I realized that we didn't even have a name to call this incredible American engagement with Ukraine. And I became sort of really interested in this, and I started asking not only officials inside the US government, but also experts outside of the government, what do you call this? This, by the numbers, the billions and billions of dollars that the US has spent is actually the largest such effort to fund a military operation since the end of World War II. It is an extraordinary and really almost without precedent in the modern era commitment that the United States has made. I asked the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, this question, and I said, well, I know you don't want to call this a proxy war, and before I could even finish the rest of my question, of course, he immediately said, it's absolutely not a proxy war, and we got into a back and forth around that. But the point I want to make is that he didn't have an answer for what to call it, and nobody had an answer for what to call it. We don't know the name of this moment, and I think that's actually because it's so very dangerous and so very volatile. But I want to change gears just for the end of this conversation tonight, and I want to actually stop talking about the rest of the world and start talking about what's happening here in the US. And this is my answer a little bit to the question of what do we call this moment? Because it actually is my view that this may be the moment that is a coming to an end of a certain moment of American power and American leadership in the world. And I have to confess, actually, that for a foreign policy wonk like the rest of you, I actually have a hard time talking about foreign policy and geopolitics these days, which seems weird in the sense that the world is literally on fire and so much is happening. But the reason I say this is because really for the last few years, I have become very, very convinced that if you want to understand the disruption that's happening in the world, there's really only one place to be and to focus on, and that's here in Washington and in the United States. And I think back to a conversation that I had with Strobe Talbot, the former Undersecretary of State and head of the Brookings Institution, in the very early weeks of the Trump administration, in the winter of 2017. And, we sat down. Of course, we were talking about Russia. He's been a lifelong Russia hand. And he said something to me that's just always stuck with me, though. He said, Susan, sitting in this seat where you're sitting, just the other day, I had, a very senior official from Japan who was here, and I said, well, why have you come to visit us in Washington? What is the purpose of your trip? And the official, I think it was the Japanese National Security Advisor, said, well, I'm here because Washington is the new epicenter of global instability. And, you know, that insight was a profound insight. If anything, it's even more the case today than it was at that time. Years later, American leadership in the world is just undeniably both shaped and constrained by our own increasingly dysfunctional politics. It is also true that even our ability to lead, I think, has been called into question by our internal divisions. The stakes in the 2024 presidential election are not just existential in terms of American democracy. They're not just us litigating perennial debates over the size of the government or how much in taxes we should pay or what kind of healthcare system we should have. To a very real extent, this debate that we're about to have over the next year will shape events around the world. And I would argue that foreign policy and basic questions of national security, of American leadership in the world, offer one of the sharpest and clearest contrasts there will be between the two most likely candidates that we're going to have. Think just about the Ukraine war as one quick example of that. From the very beginning of this conflict, what have we heard from President Biden? We've heard, well, America will be there as long as it takes for Ukraine. It's a very stirring statement. It's an important statement. We've followed that up, arguably, in many ways with extraordinary resources and commitment. But the truth, as everyone here knows, and we're sitting in Washington, is that as long as it takes might be until next week, literally until next week. And, you know, that's not a formula for American leadership in the world. No matter what the intentions are of the most skilled possible group of diplomats and advisors and thinkers. As long as we remain divided against ourselves and facing this stark set of choices, I think we have to be able to follow the data points where they lead us. And, you know, one of the things that most stick out to me, and I think that's the value add as a journalist. You know, we are by nature generalists, we're dabblers, but sometimes we can catch a little bit of the zeitgeist that perhaps those who are more truly knowledgeable cannot. And here's a data point, you know, that really leapt out for Peter and I when we were working on our book about the Trump presidency. The real difference is not so much one of policy and approach when it comes to national security, although the words may be kind of disruptive or radical. But we're talking about a situation where we've never had a president of the United States before who consistently not only praises, but really seeks to work and to elevate America's adversaries at the expense of its allies. And I know that that's a hard thing to think about. Well, what does that really mean? I've heard lots of people say, well, you know, we survived the first term, it's okay. There's a lot of commonality these days between Republicans and Democrats, at least on some core issues of foreign policy. While there's concerns among Republicans about support for Ukraine, it's still bipartisan to a large degree in the country. And I would say, thank goodness. You can also point to some real consistency between what we've seen from this current administration and the previous administration when it comes to taking in a much tougher line toward China and having arguably a much more realistic approach to this age of great power competition that we find ourselves in. But I come back to this much more ephemeral question of leadership. At a moment in time when the President of the United States, you have a guy right now who loves nothing more than to get on the phone and to yak with America's allies. And, you know, we're facing a kind of a choice that was summed up for me in a conversation Peter and I reported in our book, The Divider. Donald Trump's second White House Chief of Staff was John Kelly, the much decorated Marine general who spent a lot of his time, as we all now know, seeking in many ways to constrain the president or to stop him from doing various things. But in all of those stories, there was one that stood out for us. And it was one day in the Oval Office when the president said to John Kelly, well, he was trying to block him from doing something. They said, you know, you effing generals, how come you're not more like the German generals? And John Kelly said, what are you talking about, sir? What are you talking about? And Trump said, you know, the German generals, like in World War II, they were totally loyal to Hitler. John Kelly, stunned, starts to sort of litigate the point, which I always found to be a weird part of the story. But he says, no, they weren't. No, they weren't. They tried to kill Hitler 3 times. You know, Trump looks at him and says, what are you, crazy? No, they were totally loyal to him. Kind of missing the point here, right? But the point is, this happened, right? This has consequences that you can't imagine. Don't give up your ability to imagine even the unthinkable things. Just last week, Peter and I were in Berlin and thinking about the anniversary both of the fall of the Berlin Wall and also of Kristallnacht. Germany, like the United States, has rising anti-Semitism. It has a large and growing far-right ultra-nationalist party, the AfD. In fact, we had a very chilling conversation with a senior foreign diplomat based in Berlin who told us he was most concerned about the rise of the AfD, which has not yet really registered, I don't think, here in the United States. He said, whatever you hear, I want you to understand, these folks, they are real Nazis. That's a pretty chilling conversation to have with anyone, and certainly sitting in Berlin, I have to say. And yet, I think for me, there was an even more chilling conversation that Peter and I had with a senior German official. We talked about these developments in American politics here. He said, in many ways, for Germany, they were paying closer attention to the election in the United States even to what is happening in a war just a few hours drive away from their borders. And the reason is because they understand the internal dysfunction that we're experiencing now can have massive global consequences. At the end of this very sad and depressing conversation, he said, you know, for Germans, it was bittersweet because they felt that perhaps it was a moment when the rest of the world and that us here in Washington would understand perhaps we're not so exceptional here in Germany after all. I'll leave you with this story. When Peter and I and Greg were based in Moscow, it was really only about 10 years after the fall of the Soviet Union. We could envision different paths that were still possible for Russia. But already, I think it was pretty clear, at least what Vladimir Putin intended to do at home. There was a conference one day. It was to celebrate the anniversary of the Carnegie Moscow Center. By the way, just a little asterisk to this story, the Carnegie Moscow Center is no longer in Moscow. It's in exile in Berlin, along with the rest of what we might call Free Russia. Grigory Yavlinsky, a liberal politician and party leader, was asked a question on a panel at this conference. He was asked about the future of Russian democracy. He was silent for a moment. He thought, well, what can I possibly answer? He said, okay, I'm going to answer this question with an old Soviet anecdote. You want to ask me about Russian democracy? I'll tell you about the ambulance that came to pick up a patient in Moscow. They drove and they drove and they drove through Moscow. Finally, the patient sits up in the back of the ambulance and he says, hey, where are we going? What's going on here? How come we're not, at the hospital? What's happening? And the driver turns back and he says, well, we're not going to the hospital. We're going to the morgue. The driver says, hey, what do you mean? Don't take me to the morgue. I'm not dead. And the driver says, yes, well, we're not there yet. 20 years ago, when I first heard that joke, It was a kind of a, wry and depressing commentary on the future perspectives of Russian democracy. You couldn't tell that joke in Russia today. Now I say, I can tell this joke in Washington, and what does it mean to all of us? So I guess I'll leave you with a question. What really is so unthinkable anymore? Thank you for indulging me in these reflections. All right, well, I'd love to do questions, and apologies. I know maybe I was like a little too pessimistic, so I swear, throw me something more optimistic, and I'll try to be. All right. Well, if our host wants to have a question, I'll let you get the first one in.
Apologies to everybody else. Susan, that was incredible to hear, and thank you so much for speaking as bluntly and as brilliantly as you do. And I have to say, Susan's latest column in the New Yorker about the events of the last few days is, required reading. I would posit, in addition to what Fiona, I think, perhaps we'll see, rightly said, that maybe it's 2008, not 2013, that may be the start of World War III, if there is a World War III. There's nothing I can say to further the questions that you've posed, so I'll just ask, can you say what the next project is, February 22? Can you tell us a little bit about the concept of the book, if you could share it? And thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Greg, so much. And, the sneak preview here is, and we're just getting started on this project. I'm sure there's lots of good sources in this room, so please come see us afterwards. We would appreciate that. But the idea is actually not a Moscow book, but a book about us here in Washington and American foreign policy through the lens of the 5 US presidents who have really struggled to deal with the question of Vladimir Putin and the Russia that he's led. It's a story, I think, about the death of our expectations. It's a story of perhaps we believed our own stories too much. And it's also, I think, just really fascinating exercise in presidential history. And so it goes back to, many people forget this. They think of George W. Bush gazing into the eyes and the soul of Vladimir Putin. But actually, it was Bill Clinton who was the first US president to meet with Vladimir Putin. And so we'll tell the story from there and going forward. It was only not even 10 years after the fall of the Soviet Union when this former KGB agent comes to power in Russia. He is not only little known, but we're trying to examine the evidence of what did the United States government really know, or even try to know or understand about this KGB agent. I have to say, some of our interviews in Germany were absolutely fascinating. We're saying to some very senior former officials, well, weren't you curious what he was doing on your own territory less than 10 years earlier? And so those are the kind of questions we'll be looking at. It's my theory of the case that the United States and many of its partners spent a lot of time really underestimating Putin and also overestimating our own ability to influence him. And there are many, many, many factors and many reasons that lead up to this great tragedy of February 2022. But I think Peter and I feel like it's a really important project, and it's definitely an ambitious one. So I'm not promising you an actual release date, although if you ask our publishers, they'll say 2 years. More questions? You, sir.
Hi, thanks. I'm actually staying with somebody who knows you, whom I won't mention for reasons that will quickly become clear, but I'll tell you privately afterwards. He works for one of the networks. He's a producer. and has been trying to get access to various U.S. military operations as a reporter, and has repeatedly been rebuffed. He met with the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, who said that she has similarly found herself thwarted in her efforts to expose various things that she thinks deserve to be known by the public. And she said that she'd been blocked by the NSC. And it seems that it's actually Jake Sullivan who has taken the view that in this situation where most international competition is for hearts and minds, as you know, Gerald Chempler said, that he's taking the position that actually it's better just to remain silent about most things that the U.S. is trying to do. And I wonder what you've heard about that and what you think about that. Thanks.
Well, count me down for team transparency. Clearly, as a journalist, I think that, historically, that's been one of the U.S.'s great advantages, is having a different approach to the rest of the world and being able to show off a democracy in action. So I don't know exactly the specifics you're referring to, but I find it to be very worrisome. And, I only had a brief career myself as a war correspondent. Definitely, it's not a permanent life that I would choose. But one of the things that made an incredible impression on me was the experience of the war in Iraq in 2003, and talk about a failure of our collective ability to imagine the unthinkable. I think that probably the most useful lesson I ever got in covering Washington was actually to be sitting in Kuwait at the beginning of the Iraq War with a colleague of mine, a journalist who had actually covered the war in Vietnam. And he said there were a bunch of U.S. Marines, and we were in the headquarters hotel where the officials who were in charge of deciding how we could cover the war were staying. And our colleague, this is in the early days, remember there was some resistance, and it was clear the U.S. wasn't being greeted with flowers and parades, and yet we still couldn't fully absorb what was happening. We were still waiting for the WMD to be found. But my colleague who had covered Vietnam, he was a bit of a prankster, and he sat there at breakfast one day, we were talking about this, and he gets up and he says, "Give me a Q, give me a U, get me a G," and he spells out quagmire very loudly, right next to these very large Marines with these big guns, and they, looked very unhappy. We dragged him, said, sit down, please. We don't want to get shot. And, I think the point of this story, of course, was that he was right, and we just couldn't really wrap our minds around the data. And in that war, we went because our news organizations were willing to absorb the risk and the cost. There were embedded reporters with the U.S. military, but we were there as unilateral, unembedded reporters because the U.S. military wouldn't allow us to see the events on the ground that we wanted to see in southern Iraq. And so we drove there on our own at that time. And actually, the U.S. military, even in that conflict, instructed their British colleagues not even to allow us into the safety of the compounds that they held because we had not gone through their formal system. They wanted control over that information. So I don't think it, is specific to this particular moment, but I think it's the kind of debate that we're going to face more and more, because the bottom line is this conflict we're seeing in the Middle East right now, it's, as we all know, sadly, it's not going to just be over in a few days or even a few weeks. And we're going to be looking at more and more conflicts, I'm afraid, that are going to pose these questions to American administrations and to journalists. Thank you. Where's my happy question, my optimistic Serge?
Susan, listening to your wonderful but very scary talk in this beautiful setting reminded me of a line from a great movie, Some Like It Hot. The situation is hopeless, but not bad. I That's what we can take away here this evening. But that's not my question. My question is something we've talked about before, something that goes back to what you said and you've written, that we got Putin wrong, that we didn't get him until it was too late. At the same time, this evening you said that we overestimated our ability to do anything about it. What difference would it have made if we got him right? What did that mean? Would that have changed anything?
This is a great question. If you didn't hear, what difference would it have made? Let's stipulate to the idea that we got Putin wrong. What difference would it have made had we gotten him right? And, look, I know that, engaging in history hypotheticals is, in a way, a fool's errand. We can debate all night, and everybody gets the luxury of still deciding at the end of the day that whatever they think is right. So, I think it's hard to know, of course, but Greg mentioned 2008. I think there are moments along the way where it's clear that had Putin been met with a different reaction, perhaps a different chain of events would have unfolded. His inclinations were always where they were, and again, history and hindsight is much easier to do. So, we can all pick up the breadcrumbs of the many times that Putin told this or that person, about his desire to see Ukraine as part of Russia again, for example, and we didn't pick up on that at the time. I think that kind of second guessing is hard to do, but I think in pure looking at these events, what happened after Russia invaded Georgia in 2008? Well, within months, we had a reset policy. Within months, we were having high-level Western officials meeting with him in Germany, where we just were. I was really stunned to see the numbers here. This is even later, after the invasion of Crimea. Germany went from having approximately 35% of its energy supplied by Russia, its oil and gas, after 2014 and Crimea, after the sanctions that the United States, along with the European Union, imposed on Russia. Germany's dependence on Russian energy went from 35% to over 50% after Putin invaded Crimea. So could he have reasonably thought that we would not impose long-term costs, or that we would impose costs that were survivable to him? Absolutely. So again, I don't know if I would pick one particular moment in time, but I have to say, there were so many of these incidents with Putin, and immediately, what would you hear here in Washington? I understand, diplomats have to do what diplomats do. They'd immediately begin talking about off-ramps. I always thought, Vladimir Putin isn't going to take your off-ramp. He's not driving on the same highway. Yeah. We can do, I think, a few more, if there's anyone else. Okay.
Hey, Susan, thanks for an excellent presentation. My name is Tom Melia. I currently work for Senator Ben Cardin, who's recently become chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. I spent a few years in the executive branch a few years ago, I guess about 6 years, and I've never seen a situation in which the United States government thought it was the stronger partner in any kind of negotiation with another country. So I was going to pick up on the same remark that you had made that Mr. Schmemann picked up on, which is this sense that the United States could shape the world and make Russia do something or other. I've never seen that. Of course, I have limited experience in the government, and I know there are some small countries that maybe we can pressure to do certain things. But in almost every instance, the United States government institutionally is trying to figure out how we can persuade, cajole, entice. We have to give them something for them to do what's in their own best interests. The other observation that I have to share in this context is that most of U.S. foreign policy, and I've not been in the rarefied places like Jake Sullivan or Bill Burns and people like that, But it seems like a lot of our foreign policy is trying to persuade other governments, whether they're friends and allies or adversaries or somewhere in the middle, to not do things that will be against their own best interests. We spend a lot of time trying to persuade them to not shoot themselves in the foot. And probably, I don't know, it's 50-50. Sometimes we persuade them, sometimes we don't. But that's mostly what U.S. foreign policy is, trying to persuade other governments not to do things that are against their own best interests. So the framing that you had about America post-Cold War and with the rise of Putin, I think that, and maybe this is what you're leading to, I think if the United States had been much more forceful and much more straightforward about what we thought the better way forward was, that we might have gotten Russia in a better place. But we spent a lot of time begging them to take our assistance when they didn't quite understand what it was for or how they would use it or what they would do with it. So I just see the kind of balance of power in the U.S. engagement with other countries, including Russia, including many smaller powers, is much less forceful and purposeful and much more kind of hoping that they won't get mad at us. So
Well,
it's a question in the form of a statement.
Well, thank you for those observations. I think it's really important to get a kind of inside perspective. I would say one thing that leaps out to me from our time in Russia is that it was a sort of a transitional moment when we were no longer really providing the assistance that we had provided in the 1990s in the immediate aftermath of the Soviet collapse. And in fact, because of the war in Iraq, which I mentioned, there was a period of time where there was a lot of conversation in Moscow about how Russia had, quote, graduated from this assistance. That was the term that was used by the U.S. bureaucrats. And, I think, again, it was an example of layering on our own thinking. That's generally what I would say. Perhaps overestimating our powers is not the right framing for it, but in general, we, like most societies in the world, are very myopic, and we tend to think of things and to project our own reality into the rest of the world. And many of you here are familiar with the kind of catastrophic consequences that such a worldview can take in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. But I would say that it probably influenced and shaped our thinking about how to engage with Russia as well. And it was a kind of a mutual misunderstanding. There's no question that Vladimir Putin almost every day makes that kind of mistake of layering his own thinking onto us and our decision-making as well. I think he was shocked, frankly. I think he was shocked by the expressions of resolve that his invasion of Ukraine met with. Perhaps it was because he was conditioned by 20 years of Western behavior not to expect it, but it was also because he doesn't understand our societies, and he makes the mistake that many dictators do of looking at the world from where he sits in his increasingly isolated room in the Kremlin. So, all right, how about one more? How about that? A final question. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. This has been truly stimulating as well as a little bit depressing.
I do apologize for that.
Well,
Luckily, the dessert looks good.
Yes. So I guess my question is simply looking at what happens next. As you're saying, we tend to perhaps misestimate in both directions what the influence of or the actions of Putin would be. But there's also a question, I think, then about what happens after him. And, the range of options, if simplistically, I would look at him as someone who cares about perhaps himself, his family, and his friends, and about Mother Russia in his own way. But then, what of the alternatives? What comes after him, and how do you see that likely to unfold?
Yeah, this is a great question, this question of what comes after. I noticed that Greg, in his introduction this evening, talked about a sort of optimistic future of a more open and democratic Russia. I thought even throwing that out there was an act of optimism, given where things are. One of the things that's very striking to me is that we arguably have less eyes on what's really happening at the highest levels in Russia and at the Kremlin than we did even in the late Cold War period. I think our engagement with Moscow is certainly less than it was in the late Cold War period. We've now seen the almost complete unraveling of this, sort of protective web of arms control treaties and other international agreements that we had with Russia that were formed in that period. Those have now essentially almost all gone out. New START, the final treaty that we have remaining, is set to expire in a couple years, and it seems very unlikely to me at the present trajectory that it will be reinstated. I was just told the other day that there's not even a conversation occurring about that. So we have very few eyes in a real way, and visibility is much less. Obviously, we don't even have Western correspondents on the ground to the same degree. Even at the worst period of the Cold War, there was arguably more on-the-ground presence of Western correspondents. But ever since the Russians arrested our colleague from the Wall Street Journal, Evan Gershkovich, that's really not been possible in a sustained way. You've seen Western news organizations have people come in and out. I believe one of Peter's colleagues at the Times is there right now, but I don't think it's safe for her to remain on a permanent basis. And we have really just not the level of information that we need given the dangerousness of the situation. I'm sure that was reinforced for everyone here this summer when we all watched and tried to wonder and make sense of the Prigozhin mutiny and what did it actually mean. Was it a sign of Putin's vulnerability? Was it a sign of the system, retaking control? And by the way, that message sent of a plane falling out of the sky was a pretty clear-cut message about who's in control. And I think we took from it what we were supposed to take from it. Bill Burns, who was briefly mentioned here tonight, said Vladimir Putin is a guy who likes his revenge served cold. The plane didn't fall out of the sky a week after the mutiny, but a couple months later. I think that it's too easy to look for a magic solution, whether it's to our own troubles here in the United States or to what's happening inside of Russia and its trajectory. I think just as perhaps we've come to understand that Donald Trump was not a one-off, but that a kind of a Trumpism, whatever you want to call it, is going to be with us even were he not to announce tomorrow that he wasn't running for president. It's not something we would be done with. We can't go back to the world of November 3rd, 2016 and before. And I think that's very much true in Russia as well. This idea that we're either going to have Putin or some democratic small d revolution akin to that magic period of the fall of the Berlin Wall, where I began this conversation this evening. I really wish we could say that, there's a world that looks like November 10th, 1989 for all of us in the immediate future. But whatever is ahead for Russia, I don't think it's going to feel to us like November 10th, 1989. I'll leave it at that, but I want to thank all of you for your terrific questions and thoughts this evening.
Susan, that was spectacular. Thank you so much. This was a real treat for us. The breadth of your commenting about developments around the world is just it was brilliant. Thank you. Before I will sign off, I'd like to thank all of you for coming here tonight. I want to thank ICWA supporters for everything that you do for us. The Institute would not exist without you. Thanks to my colleagues, Bruce Teeter and Harley Dultz, for doing so much to organize tonight. No need to rush off. Please stick around. But I will now say good night to you all. Thank you.